Disney scoped out Central Florida as a potential site for Walt Disney World. The evidence reveals that it was unwilling to locate there unless it could fundamentally alter the legal regime within which it would be required to operate. Disney wanted a governance structure overseeing its operation with broad jurisdiction, discretion, and flexibility to approve projects. And it wanted a governing authority that would sufficiently align with Disney's interests so as to effectively give Disney control. This is what it was seeking when it drafted the 1967 Act and what it achieved by getting the legislation it requested.
Now, I want to be clear what he's saying. When it drafted, meaning Disney, yes, the Walt Disney Company drafted the legislation and then handed it to the Florida legislature and said, here, sign this. This wasn't something that Florida itself came up with, right? Now, of course, the Florida state legislature could have said, no, but they didn't. Why? Because Disney made all kind of promises, and they wanted basically autonomous power. They wanted God mode power.
But also, this was going to be the biggest development. It's hard for us to remember, especially because none of us are old enough to remember it, what Florida was like in those days. It was nothing.
There was a swamp where that is. There was nothing. Yeah.
This was a huge deal.
Yep. And so the legislature was basically willing to do anything, give Disney anything. So Disney wrote their bill. They wrote the 1967 deal themselves with everything they wanted in it, right down to the fact of we don't have to do this, we don't have to pay for that, we don't have to come up with this, we don't want to have to go through, we'll have building codes and permitting, but it's not going to matter, we're not going to follow any of them. We want to be able to do everything we want without any government, anything in our way, which sounds great, right? Live and let live. The problem, of course, is that nobody else got to play by those rules. It was only Disney.
And Florida,
somewhat paradoxical.
The Florida Supreme Court also seemed, even years into that, to still believe that all of this was going to come into fruition based on what they've been told, that there were going to be residents, there were going to be real cities. It just never happened. No. So in hindsight, Florida went along with it. They had the wink and the nod, and they trusted in the company to do what they were supposed to do. Whether or not Walt himself was in on the deal, hard to say, but definitely after his death, Disney had no intentions of ever doing this the way that they had presented it to the legislators.
That's it. Walt died 3 months before the legislation was passed. Yep. So that's the difference.
It's meant creating jurisdiction with wider authority and independence, yet less power over its principal developer on the part of the actual governing authority. Notably, statements from Disney's consultants working for the development of the RCID described the motivation for seeking more authority as including to overcome what they described as a, quote, governance problem. The answer from Disney's consultants included limiting the scope of democracy. In one statement, they said, quote, new community developers should be exempted from processing their plans and development through local governing bodies. It was all a part of this concept that they were selling and getting the Reedy Creek Improvement Act, in which they claimed to the authorities that were from which they were seeking the act that they needed to constantly be in, quote, a state of becoming, and that the only way you could constantly be in this evolutionary state of becoming would be, quote, to be freed from the impediments to change. And this is Disney's actual language. They considered impediments to change to include things that were, quote, rigid building codes, traditional property rights, and elected political officials. RCID is sui generis, i.e. it does not fit the mold of special districts and thus should not be compared to most other special districts so classified under Florida or other state laws. Normally, when we use the term special district, we're referring to a single and specific purpose, or in some cases multi but still limited purpose jurisdiction, such as for fire protection, water supply, drainage, soil and water conservation, sewage, or housing and community development. This special district would then have authority limited to what was necessary to serve the limited purposes, including sometimes the ability to raise revenue for a specific purpose, and not generalized jurisdiction, generalized planning, or generalized lawmaking powers. Almost all special districts are defined by their purpose, which is determined by the type of service or public need that is being fulfilled by its creation. Entirely atypical is to create a special district motivated to create a mostly general purpose governance structure to carve out a jurisdiction that will serve the needs of a particular constituent or designed to advance a particular industry or particular private purpose.
Or one company named Disney.
Yet arguably, this atypical design for a special district was what Disney drafted and proposed to the legislature leading to the 1967 Act. It created a jurisdiction that, unlike municipalities and counties in Florida, does not have the kind of diverse citizenry and voting public that generates a check on governmental abuse, largesse, or favoritism. The RCD has no residential or voting base of any significance, given that the population consists of less than 100 residents district-wide, almost all of whom are picked by or arguably beholden to or indebted to Disney in some of the ways that Mr. Jennings already identified. And aside from the low numbers, these residents may vote for municipal officials, but the municipalities inside the RCID have few powers, to the point they are often called paper cities.
And he's talking about Lake Buena Vista and Bay Lake, the two cul-de-sacs, with about 10 or 12 double-wide mobile homes around in a semicircle.
Also, Valiant, can we give just a moment for for Ron to explain something? Because
yeah, sure.
I know it's been handled in some videos previously and on other channels, but there's so many people watching right now. You have 2,300, 2,400 any point watching, and folks, let's get those likes up to 1,500 if we can. But for a moment, Ron, could you explain? There was a term he used, which I believe was sui generis. What does that mean when he's referring to Disney and Reedy Creek being such?
It is Latin for unique to itself, meaning it is not one of a genera. It is not merely a typical example of a species or a genera of phenomena, but rather it is its own thing.
One of a kind?
One of a kind in a, and therefore, as he says, not, you can't deduce what should be done regarding Disney from what is done regarding other special districts.
I see. There's no existing precedent.
Neither precedent nor even guidance.
Yeah. And that's one of the things he did mention several times, as the others did as well. There's no other district anywhere. And Cochin even stated a moment ago, this district, the RCID, should not be compared to any other district in the state of Florida. And that's why, because it is so wholly unique. And in fact, this particular arrangement from 1967 has never before or since been created anywhere else, not only in Florida, but anywhere else in the U.S. Nobody did this because it was such a bad idea.
And aside from the low numbers, these residents may vote for municipal officials, but the municipalities inside the RCID have few powers, to the point they are often called paper cities. There's more detail on that also in the Kimley Horn report. Often just carving out through de-annexation to ensure they cannot become effective checks on Disney's capture of RCID power.
You're talking about the Celebration Florida situation there. So they paper cities. The voters aren't really voters. The voters are people that are stuck in there by Disney to do and vote and do everything that Disney wants. That's what they're going to do. And as soon as that power gets threatened by, oops, there's more people moving in, let's de-annex Celebration Florida, get these people out so they can't override the power, the phony cities that we've put into place here.
The 1967 Act rather shockingly exempts the RCD from application of later passed land use regulations, zoning, or building codes, insulating it from control of general changes in these areas from the state and its authorities, unless the law expressly removes the exemption. The decision to exempt Disney from typical regional impact obligations also meant that Disney had successfully lobbied for a substantial cost advantage over competitors who would need to comply with new statutes, including mitigation obligations to offset regional impacts, while Disney would not.
Like Universal Studios, like SeaWorld, like Busch Gardens, like so on and so forth.
And this is precisely what interest group theory would predict would happen. Both the Florida legislature creating the powers of the 1967 Act and the Supreme Court of Florida finding them constitutional based on their decisions on reliance on a belief that the RCID would eventually have inhabitants that would make this authority subject to the powerful checks provided by democratic accountability, all contributed to this. Disney in the 1967 Act was seeking out these special advantages, but needed to sell the story that there would be inhabitants.
Listen.
Because only a popularly elected government could regulate land use and building, they consistently promised in the days leading up to the passage of the 1967 Act that it would create a model city, quote, functioning community where 20,000 people would live and work and play.
Where 20,000 people would live and work and play. Sounds an awful lot like what they're trying to build now in North Carolina. They're supposed to do it 55 years ago in Florida. Call it Epcot, experimental prototype city of tomorrow. Then Walt died and they made it a theme park.
The record reveals that Disney never intended, however, to follow through on this promise because it indeed had a disdain for voters. From the earliest days of strategic planning for Disney World, Walt Disney, on several occasions and in several points of documented evidence, sought to avoid being controlled by voters. To get the 1967 Act passed, however, they needed to say they would create a normal city. But once the 1967 Act was passed, pretense slowly disappeared. Please note, I do not conclude that the RCID would be normal and consistent with good governance if the Disney promises had been fulfilled. The 1967 Act created an unenforceable legislative bargain, however. Despite the promises made by Disney to create housing and to populate the RCID with citizens and voters, promises made to induce the legislature to grant Disney special privileges that Disney claimed were necessary to effectively accomplish their grand plan, including housing, there are no built-in ways to hold Disney accountable for the failure to fulfill their promises. In other words, legislative action was induced by Disney's promises and the legislature performed, but it has not been able to get the full benefit of the bargain. In fact, Disney appears to regularly find ways to have a continued absence of voters. De-annexation efforts, including what we saw with Celebration, are all good illustrations. Consider, for example, the parking garages in Disney Springs, which were provided by the district but serve entirely the profit-making enterprise of Disney rather than a public purpose. Not only did Disney get the cost savings of not having to pay for those garages itself, the fact that they are owned by the government means the parking garages do not generate tax revenues. Billions of dollars of assets kick off no public community benefits when structured this way.
And I'd like to...
Okay, this is the third one coming in here, but what he's referring to is the $700 million parking garages that were built for Disney Springs, paid for by RCID and the taxpayers.
Did you say 7 million?
700 million.
Yeah, Andrew said 700 million. Okay.
Yeah, there's $7 million was to move the 3 holes on the golf course.
Right.
$700 million to build these 3 parking lots that was paid for by RCID taxpayers.
I think we need a Mexican Iron Man Hilton Head Island Improvement District where I get a new pool, and I need a walkway to the dock, and then I need a new boat dock. Oh, and I need a boat too, so I can do better accounting somehow.
Yep. Why not? Why not?
Red flags are going to raise in my email if I get an offer for any Mexican Iron Man issued municipal bonds. I'll be a little worried.
Don't worry, they'll be tax free whether they are or not, or filed. And don't worry, my assistant's going to email you the training order Friday. And she's not licensed, but she's going to email it to you. Don't worry about it.
Just real quick, Ron, any comments you want to make on what Professor Cochin was going through there from a legal?
Well, he
standpoint?
mentioned something called interest group theory, and this is something that you know certainly as a financial expert. It's the concept that in any system, much less one like the Reedy Creek, like the 67 Act, which is jerry-rigged from go, the regulated and end up becoming the regulators. There's a revolving door and an interplay, and there's what's called administrative capture. I mean, this is not a legal thing, but I happen to have studied political science, and it is something that's relevant in administrative law. That what we see is that people who are considered to be sufficiently expert enough to deal with a particular body of administrative law are deemed the ones who are best qualified to act as administrators. So they take turns being administrators and being administrated. But in this case, in a way, I'm almost surprised that he alluded to that theory, because exactly, Mephitic Miasma points out, this isn't administrative capture, it's administrative assimilation. It's even beyond that. I mean, it's a total scam. It's a total scam. So yes, it's true that interest group theory would predict this, but this is so sweet generous that you don't need any theories.
Make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.